change your world. It's time to let it go. The things you used to think, the things you used to know, they don't help you anymore. It's time to change your mind. If it's peace you want to find.
This is Kurt Kaikonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Change Your World, we'll be in the book of Joshua. So grab your Bible and let's get started.
It's time to change your world. You need to let it go. Oh, oh.
And it says that the Gibeonites were crafty. And that doesn't mean that they were building little bird houses or scrapbooking. What it means is that they were creating this great deception. They were going to put on this great play for Israel. And so they were going to have to get all their costumes just right and to get all their actors all dressed up as ambassadors, and that they're coming away from this far away country, from a place that you never heard of before, because this is a land far, far away. And so this is almost like a fairy tale, because this is a fairy tale, because this is all make-believe. And then they dug through their garbage and they took the old bread that they were probably going to feed to their pigs. And then they put it in their old sacks and they put their wine into their old, most torn and mended wineskins. And then they wear all their old patched up garments and their worn out sandals. And then they loaded up their donkeys. And then they drove them over there and they started looking like the Beverly Hillbillies coming down through the hills of Gilgal. Now, this is a different Gilgal than the Gilgal that they stayed at when they first crossed the Jordan. And the very first thing that we hear out of the Gibeonites' mouths from our reading is where they just come out and they say, make a covenant with us. And they tell Joshua their lie, because we're from a very, very far away place. And Israel here, they knew that they were Hivites. And it may be because the language that they spoke, or maybe it was because of their accent. But they did have some discernment here, because this didn't sit right with them. And so they call it out right away. And it almost came out as if they were accusing them of lying. And they say, how do we know you don't live among us? How can we make a covenant with you? And so they ask all the right questions, and they never thought to pray about it. And we're told in verse 15 that they never did ask counsel of the Lord, because I believe if they would have asked him, he would have given it. And the Gibeonites here, they didn't address any of the questions that Israel asked them when they asked about where they're from. They just said, we're your servants, which is very humble. And Israel, they're not used to people treating them like this, because so far, every foreign people that have come across Israel, they've cursed them and they've been hostile to them and they've tried to fight them. So this is very different. This is different because these people seem to like them, but it still doesn't sit right with Joshua, because he asks them straight up. He says, who are you? Where do you come from? So now this is twice now, because there is this sense that the Lord gives to his people. He gives them this discernment about when they're being lied to. And this discernment, I believe, God gives to all of us, and it comes from God when somebody's trying to con you. But you can override this discernment, and you can ignore it. And these people are good liars. And these people, they wrote a really good play, and they put it on. They could have all won Academy Awards. And then what they do to convince them is they use a little God talk, some religious words as if they're God seekers. That we came from a far country because we heard of your God's fame and we came to worship him. And now they're confessing this belief in their God. In all good cons, they usually have a God bless you with it, a little God talk. You almost see it written on every cardboard sign ever held by any street beggar, because it's a quick way to throw off real believers, because we want to fall for it every time. And they're so clever here because what they tell of what they've heard about their God. that how they have heard about their deliverance from Egypt, which was 40 years ago. And then they're very quick to mention these two victories over the two kings of the Amorites from the other side of the Jordan River, with King Og and King Sihon from Bashan and Heshbon. And these are the same exact battles that Rahab knew about. So all they were telling them was old news. They're not going to say a word about Jericho or Ai because that's too new, because those had just happened in the last couple of weeks. And that would undo their deception, because if they had come away from a faraway land like they were claiming, they couldn't have heard of those battles yet. And so they keep talking about how great their God is and how their people had sent them away to become their servants because of the fame of their God. And then the Gibeonites, they just bring them back to look at their stuff. We're from so far away that all this stuff was new when we left. And now all our water bottles leak and our clothes are worn and torn and our bread is garbage. And it was hot when we left. But they just left yesterday. But your God was so important to us that we had to come make peace with you. We had to have a treaty. So they were so humble and so kind. And they called themselves our servants. So what's not to like about these people? These people think we're great. Finally, somebody got it right. Somebody finally recognizes how great we are. And so all the leaders, they went back and they looked at their stuff, and seeing all the evidence, it supported everything that they said. And then Israel leaders, they wanted to believe this, because if they were their servants and they were a foreign people from far away, they would be paying them tribute, which is money. They would be giving them taxes. In Israel here, they're only looking at the evidence. They're only looking at the science. And they didn't seek God in any way to see if they were to make this treaty. And they gave no time to ask God about what he thought. So they're all walking by sight. They're not walking by faith. And this is the second time since they crossed the Jordan that they made this same exact mistake. They do things and they're doing them without praying, because this is the same mistake Joshua made about not seeking God, like the first time when Israel went up against Ai. And so this prayerless life is starting to become a problem for Israel, not seeking God's will about anything in prayer. And so what they do is they actually violate God's law, and they make a covenant that they should have never made. And all of these leaders, they swore to the Gibeonites in the name of Yahweh. And then it was only 3 days later that they find out, because it's almost like Israel, they just start walking through their neighborhoods because it's only 25 miles away. And it's kind of like, hey, what are you doing here, Joe? We thought you lived far away. Yeah, we live here. And even though Israel was deceived, and even though the Gibeonites had lied, they knew that they couldn't get out of their covenant. And it's because they swore by the name of Yahweh. Or else they would have taken God's holy name in vain. And that would have brought about God's judgment on Israel. And we'll see this later, that God did require Israel to keep this covenant that they made with the Gibeonites. Because even after 400 years, King Saul, he will go kill some of the Gibeonites because of his zeal for Israel. And a famine arose during the reign of King David because of what Saul had done to the Gibeonites. And he was told why they were having this famine by the prophets. So this covenant was valid, and God honored this covenant, and he expected Israel to keep their bad covenant. And so now the whole congregation of Israel, they're all mad at their leaders for making this covenant. And that's primarily because they won't be able to plunder the Gibeonites and to keep all their stuff when they destroyed their cities. And so the leaders, they tell them, well, we can't go back on our word, but we'll make them our slaves. They'll cut all your wood and they'll haul all your water. So we're going to try to make the best out of a bad situation. And then Joshua, he goes and he confronts the Gibeonites, but it's too late. And the Gibeonites now, they don't even try to hide the fact that they lied. They make absolutely no excuses at all. They all just admit it. And Joshua, he asks them, why? Don't you know you're cursed now? You're going to be slaves. And the Gibeonites were very honest with Joshua. And they're telling him that they were clearly told that God had commanded Moses to kill all the inhabitants of the land. And they were deathly afraid. They all knew that they were dead men. And even though they don't know this God, they believe him. They believe what he says will come to pass. And they say, you can do whatever you want with us. We're in your hands. And it doesn't say it anywhere, and I didn't read it anywhere, but I think that God was very aware of these people. And I think it's a lot like the way that God was very aware of Rahab the harlot, that there was a people there who wanted to be saved and that they were willing to give up everything they had to be God's people. And you'll see that there's nobody else in the whole land of Canaan through the rest of the book of Joshua who ever tried to seek any peace with Israel except for these Gibeonites. And so God, I believe that he allowed Israel, who wouldn't have had any reason or any right to make any type of peace with these Gibeonites, that he allowed them to be deceived so that the Gibeonites could have peace with God. Because God, he could have always revealed to Joshua who these people were and where they lived. But God didn't choose to do that. God kept silent. And even though the leaders were going to make them their woodcutters and their water boys for the people, Joshua, he had enough sense to make them servants of God. That they would be cutting the wood and carrying the water for the tabernacle, that he's going to keep them very close to the things of God. So he gives them no place to spread their idolatry in Israel. And so I see these people a lot like Rahab, willing to give up all their former associations of their past lives, with all the relationships with all the other peoples and all their other gods to be saved. They were willing to give that all up for this one God, and that they're always knowing that they're not worthy, that they have no right to this relationship, that it's only out of God's mercy and their faith in him that they even had a chance, because they knew before that they were doomed to destruction. They were doomed to death. But God was willing to make a covenant with them to be saved. And you might think that, well, maybe these Gibeonites are a bunch of peace seekers, like maybe they were like some kind of hippies, and maybe it was because they were a weak people and they couldn't fight. But that's not true, because you'll read in chapter 10, verse 2, it says that all of their men were mighty. And I don't get the impression that they ever served God grudgingly, that they only did it because they had to, just because they were being forced. I believed they loved serving their new God. And they served him out of love for him. And that's because he saved them and he gave them life. So I believe there is no place that they would rather be. And if you really look at it, they're not much different here than the Levites, because the Levites, they're the ones who are assigned to do manual labor for the tabernacle. And later on, the Gibeonites will be called the Nephilim, which means the given ones, because they were given to the priests to assist the priests. And their city, the city of Gibeon, it became one of the Levitical cities. So this became a city of refuge where any person who was being pursued to death, they could flee to. And you'll never read in the scriptures that any of the Gibeonites ever caused any trouble in Israel at any time. And you'll even find that some of these Gibeonite men, that they became some of David's mighty men. And during those reigns of King David and King Solomon, the Ark of the Covenant, it stayed for periods of time in Gibeon. So you can see that God's presence was comfortable to stay with them. And then even after this, after 500 years, and after the reigns of the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah, and the remainder of Israel were all exiled to Babylon because of their sin of idolatry, the Gibeonites were also exiled with them. But when Israel was allowed to return, you'll see that most of Israel, they didn't return. And that was because they became too prosperous in Babylon. And so they didn't want to come back to this broken city where life would be too hard. But the record shows that 500 men of Gibeon, they returned, and that they came and they helped to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. And there's a part of me that thinks that if any of the other inhabitants of Canaan, if they would have turned from their gods, and if they would have sought peace with God, and if they were willing to serve him, I believe God would have found a way to save them too. And you might think, well, this is a pretty good story. But how does this apply to us today as believers? And I would say there's a couple ways that this applies to us. We see these types of situations in our Christian lives when we see like a believer and they knowingly make a covenant with a non-believer, like a marriage. And we can see it when a non-believer will give a little God talk and they'll pretend allegiance to the believer's God to be able to deceive them because they want to get married and they want to have a husband or they want to have a wife. And our God is very clear here that we're not to be married like that. We're not to be unequally yoked. And you'll often see the believers to try to justify this relationship with the non-believer, saying, oh, they believe something. They're just not a mature Christian, but they're growing. But there's no real fruit. And then they might go point to their good works as evidence to prove that they have some kind of belief, to prove that they are who they say they are. But it's all manufactured to get a covenant. And then we see these marriages, you'll see some of these take place, and you'll see that nobody before getting married, they ever really sought God to try to find out what God thought, because they don't want to know what God thinks. They want to get married. But then after the marriage happens, and then there's problems, and the marriage doesn't work out because they don't have the same beliefs. And now they're admitting that they're not a believer, or one of them's not a believer. The other part of this that takes place is that as a believer, you need to keep your vow. You're not allowed to desert the marriage. And what you'll see that oftentimes, and not every time, but often, if they will stick through it, you'll often see, like with the Gibeonites, that God will redeem that marriage. And sometimes they'll become believers. And now we're going to kind of shift over to communion, and we're going to think about our covenant, because God, he made a covenant with us. And this covenant and this story, it should give us hope, because we don't deserve this covenant. We were bound for death, and we've lied and we've deceived God, and we've even done this after he's made that covenant with us. But even with us not keeping our part, like in this story, God, we see that his character is that he's still going to keep his vow. And that's all because God is who he is, and God is good. So last week, we left Joshua and Israel regretting this covenant that they made with the Gibeonites, who were the native Hittites living in the city of Gibeon. And though the Gibeonites deceived the leaders of Israel, this covenant was binding because Israel swore in the name of the Lord. And though it was wrong on Israel's part, I believe God was very aware of the Gibeonites, and he provided a way for them to be saved, to give them a life instead of death. And when you look at Gibeon now, well, they have peace with God now that they're accepted by God. Where before they served God they were deathly afraid of him, what he would do to them, because they had no relationship with this God of Israel. And so now that the Gibeonites are saved, it's just like it is with us. When we become Christians and when we get saved, we're now God's enemies are mad. And the people who were once our allies, these people who we once had fellowship in our common godless causes, and they begin to attack us and they try to destroy this new relationship that we have with God. And so now we begin chapter 10 and we read about this king that comes from Jerusalem. And this is the first time in the Bible that we ever hear of the city of Jerusalem. And this king's name is Adoni-Zedek, which probably sounds a little familiar to most of us because it sounds a lot like Melchizedek. And Melchizedek, he was the king of Salem. He was the one who had come to Abraham in the book of Genesis. And the city of Salem, where King Melchizedek was from, is the same city as Jerusalem, where Adoni-Zedek is from. And so some people suggest that Zedek is just the name of a dynasty, that it's a dynasty name given to the kings from Jerusalem. And where Melchizedek means king of righteousness, Adoni-Zedek means Lord of righteousness. But this king, he is not a righteous king at all. In fact, he's an evil king. And he's heard of Joshua, and he's heard about how he conquered Ai, and he's heard about how he's destroyed Jericho with its king. And there's already been one meeting of the evil empire where the kings of all the Southland areas have all decided to join forces. And we read about that last week back in chapter 9. And it was only the city of Gibeon, which was the only kingdom who had opted out of this alliance. And so now this king, Adoni-Zedek, he hears that Israel has peace with Gibeon and that they have a defense pact. Where now Gibeon, who was this former ally of all the other kings, has now made peace with the invaders, Israel. And what's really bothering King Adoni-Zedek is why Gibeon would join forces with Israel. Because Gibeon was not a small city like Ai. Gibeon was a force to be contended with. It was a city that could hold its own in a battle. It was a great state. It was a wealthy kingdom. It was a royal kingdom. It was a warrior city filled with trained men of war who all carried some weight in the community. And it was probably something else that was bothering this king. And it's where he is seeing that Israel isn't like them. That Israel, that they're conquering these places like Jericho, and they're taking nothing from it. But they only did it for the glory of God. And then the same thing with Ai, where they destroyed it, but they didn't use it to make a profit. And that's because that's not the way that they did business. Because of all these small kingdoms, they were all about war. That's what they did. That's how their kingdoms were structured. That's how they made a living. It was all about building these armies, building them bigger and stronger and better armies. And when they came to your city, they would take all your food. They would take anything they wanted.
You need to change your world. You need to let it go. Oh, oh, oh.
Thanks for listening to Change Your World. Change Your World is an outreach of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, and your neighborhood church. If you're listening to Change Your World in the Detroit metro area, why don't you join us for church this Sunday? Our service time is 10 a.m. at Calvary Chapel, Waterford, 183 South Winding Drive, Waterford, Michigan. We're competing with the Catholics. It's only an hour. All the donuts you can eat, and you don't have to believe a thing we say, but it could change your world.
You need to change your world.
The rest of today's message can be heard at yourneighborhoodchurch.org. So check us out and download the app. And until next week, remember,